May 4th, 2026. We are in the 5th year, day 70, since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will take a close look at the parade on May 9th on Red Square. We will also look at drone attacks on Moscow, almost as if we predicted it yesterday during the live stream. And what we will also take another look at are, of course, interesting personnel decisions, and this time on the Russian side. Yesterday, there was another live stream, and I saw that it was very well received. I hope you all enjoyed the Q&A. There were still a lot of questions left that remained unanswered. I think there were about 40 towards the end. So really, there was a lot of engagement from the community. Thank you very much at this point. I'm really proud of this community. Of course, I will try to collect all these questions at some point and answer them as well. Maybe not next stream, but occasionally at month's end. But let's take a look somewhere else, namely towards the front, because for days, we've hardly seen any territorial gains. For weeks now, I can hardly report any territorial gains here in the Situation Report. Yesterday, during the live stream, I quickly discussed all recent territorial gains along the front from the past few weeks. Let's analyze last month first, then see why there were few territorial gains. April 2026 showed quite clearly how differently the same war can be assessed, depending on which data you use. On the Ukrainian side, the analysis by Deep State concludes that Russia gained about 141 square kilometers. In this case, of course, that means Deep State is a Ukrainian source. It is also run by Ukrainians, but is still considered quite conservative and cautious when it comes to reporting territorial gains, especially when it comes to their own. And they report about 141 square kilometers of lost territory. That's less than in March. That means the Ukrainians are losing less and less territory according to this trend. And that's also a sign that the momentum on the Russian side is decreasing. But things look very different on the Russian side. There, they estimate over 300 square kilometers, which is almost twice as much territory gained as in the previous month of March. In this interpretation, the offensive has just gained momentum. Two very different images of the same battlefield, yet both sides surprisingly agree. The largest territorial gains aren't occurring where the war's outcome will be determined. They don't happen where there are hardly any strategic advantages. For example, in side skirmishes, especially on the borders of Sumy or Kharkiv. That means there is a lot of movement, but not where it would make a big strategic difference. And that's exactly the interesting part. When attacks increase, but the corresponding front sections hardly change, that doesn't indicate a clear breakthrough. It seems more like pressure with losses without real progress. That strongly reminds me of the patterns from last year. Back then, there was also a phase where a lot happened, but little was decided. So the real question isn't how many kilometers were gained, but whether momentum can be created from it. If the offensive really works, it would mean that in the next few weeks, we would see a clear change, that we could assume the offensive is really gaining momentum right now, which we haven't really seen so far. And if we don't see any change in the next few weeks, then it will remain exactly as we already know it. Movement without a decisive outcome, which means we'll see many attacks again, but hardly any change on the situation map. Just for comparison, let's just take the often greatly exaggerated territorial gains on the Russian side from their own statements. So let's assume 300 kilometers of gains on the Russian side, so 300 square kilometers. That means within the last month, across all front sections combined, that would be an area roughly equivalent to the city of Leipzig. By the way, Ukraine has over 600,000 square kilometers of territory. A Russian soldier is driving on a dirt road here and discovers a mine. All good, one might think. However, he identifies it as a plastic bag. Then he drives closer and realizes that it's not a plastic bag after all, but a piece of rubber. He then continues driving and triggers the mine. At first, you can see some doubt in him, but it almost seems like he thought that if he drove right over the center, nothing would happen. But the thing is, some mines can be triggered just by vibration or by a magnetic fuse. That night, the war came back home, as the saying goes. Because in Moscow, the safest city in Russia, drones reached the capital. Air traffic was paralyzed at first, and residents tried to film the drones. The Russians have turned the city into an air defense fortress. 2 large air defense rings have been built over the past few years. One defense ring lies about 50 kilometers from the city center. That's this outer one here. And in the inner ring, basically everything that managed to get through the outer one is intercepted. And it also consists of different systems. These aren't just a few identical systems that you can more or less outsmart. No, this is truly a multi-layered air defense. Here you have Pantsir, Tor, Buk, and everything else they could muster, including Russian mobile air defense troops who patrol the streets of Moscow or are stationed on the rooftops of some buildings. By the way, you can view a very detailed map of the air defense capabilities in the capital, including an analysis of the identified positions via the cited source on X. Besides air defense vehicles, there are also jammers and electronic warfare causing disruptions. What does that mean? That means they're also trying to disrupt drones instead of just shooting them down. The problem with that, though, is that you shouldn't do something like that in the middle of the city, but rather farther away. Because if a drone is disrupted and can no longer orient itself, for example, if the drone doesn't know where it is or where it needs to go due to the disrupted GPS signal, it will just keep flying straight ahead. And if there's a house in the way, the drone will fly into the house and can't avoid it anymore. It doesn't know where it is. It doesn't have eyes after all. That's what happened here as well, because one of the houses was hit. Now, of course, it's interesting to know where this house was located. Well, this house was located here at the blue pin. And this blue pin, right here on this street, is 6.5 kilometers away from, who would have thought, the Kremlin. That means Ukrainian drones managed to do it. Of course, you also have to add to that statement that the drone attack was reported by the Russian side as involving about 200 drones. They say 200 drones from the Ukrainian side attacked. One of these drones just hit a building here. But this one drone managed to get through this air defense ring, through the next air defense ring, through all the units that are still scattered somewhere around here, and was able to be stopped near a high-value target. But it wasn't stopped because an air defense gunner shot it down. No, it was stopped simply because a building was in the way. And this just a few days before the 9th of May and the parade on Red Square. That's obviously a pretty good sign. We saw the same thing last year as well. Shortly before the parade, the Ukrainians started sending drones toward Moscow to demonstrate once again that they can still reach the city. Of course, that increases the pressure on the Russian side. At this point, it's also psychological warfare. After a drone was intercepted just kilometers from the Kremlin, Russians are now planning a high-security event at a location meant to show strength and power, if the parade still happens as scheduled. The parade had already been reduced. There are no military vehicles, there is just a marching group. So, shortly before the parade on Victory Day, the city is once again turned into a high-security area to protect this marching group as well. Additional checkpoints have been set up around the Kremlin. Access to Red Square has already been completely blocked, but that's only part of the measures in the entire area. Armored vehicles and units with heavy machine guns have been positioned. Snipers and other armed forces are said to have taken up positions on the towers of the Kremlin itself, while helicopters are chasing some Ukrainian drones in broad daylight. The picture that emerges from this is clear: maximum security measures. Such precautions are not unusual at major state events, but the scale is particularly noticeable this time. The combination of roadblocks, military presence, and armed guards shows just how seriously the security situation is now being assessed. And if a drone happens to hit a high-rise building, the situation becomes even more serious. But in Berlin, too, the rules around May 8th and 9th are being significantly tightened. The authorities are planning to completely ban a number of symbols from public spaces. This includes flags of the Soviet Union, Russia, and Belarus. Flags from Chechnya are also affected. But it's not just about flags. Well-known symbols, such as the mentioned Z and V symbols, as well as the St. George's ribbon, are also to be banned. These symbols have been repeatedly used in Russian military propaganda since the war began. With the ban, the authorities apparently want to prevent these Memorial Days from being overshadowed by political messaging or provocation. At the same time, this measure shows how even historical anniversaries can be changed by current conflicts. What was actually meant to serve as a commemoration is increasingly becoming a security policy issue. What other effects does this have? Definitely even higher security measures, not just for the parade, but especially for Putin. He already lives quite isolated. That also applies to his close circle of confidants. In the Kremlin, there are increasing indications that the greatest concern now no longer comes from outside, but from within. Security measures have been introduced around Putin that go far beyond the usual. Employees in his immediate circle are no longer allowed to use internet-enabled devices and are also not allowed to move freely in public. Even access to Putin is checked multiple times, as is access to their families. This is not a normal security protocol. This is a system that completely isolates itself. The reason becomes clear when you look at the details. After assassinations of top military officials, especially in Moscow, reports say there were high-level internal meetings. There, leading security officials blamed each other because they couldn't prevent these attacks. This shows one thing above all: trust within the elite has been shaken. At the same time, Putin himself is visibly withdrawing. He has spent almost the entire year at his villa by the lake. He avoids well-known places, reduces public appearances, except for May 9th so far at least, and apparently stays for extended periods in heavily secured facilities. By the way, in my opinion, the villa by the lake is better protected than Moscow. That doesn't happen without a reason, because the threat that is present here is different from a few years ago. It's no longer about external enemies or military risks. It's about the possibility that dangers could arise from within his own power apparatus. Names like Sergei Shoigu also come up again in this context, not as a clear leader of a coup, but rather as an actor who is perceived within the system as potentially destabilizing. When a system starts to protect itself from its own elites, that's a clear signal. The combination of internal blame, growing mistrust, and extreme security measures shows one thing above all: the fear of losing power is real, and it doesn't come from outside. In Russia, a personnel decision is currently sparking debate, and not just abroad, but also within pro-Russian circles. General Alexander Sheyko was appointed as the new commander of the aerospace forces, a position of enormous importance, especially in the current war. Sheyko is not an unknown figure. In 2022, he was among the commanders of the Russian troops who tried to capture the Kiev region from the west. As is well known, this offensive failed. In addition, there is another, much more serious point. His name is repeatedly mentioned in connection with the events in Bucha, where Russian units were accused of war crimes. But what's especially interesting is the reaction within their own camp. Of all people, many so-called Z-bloggers, who otherwise clearly support the war, are not enthusiastic about this decision. The criticism doesn't necessarily come from a moral standpoint, who would have thought, but rather from a military perspective. For them, the appointment seems completely absurd and raises many questions. Above all, why is someone being promoted who is directly connected to a failed operation? And what does that say about the current leadership and decision-making structure? That's what makes this personnel decision so explosive. It's not about filling a single position, it's about trust in military decisions and about how successes and failures have been evaluated within the system. Thank you to all channel members, subscribers, and the All Guard crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Reneke, Sylvester Tefetti, and Mir Hofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next daily report.